Hello and welcome back to another GCSE revision video. Now, what I want to do within this lesson is to go over the top 5 quotes that you can use in any Inspector Calls GCSE essay, especially given that we are in mock exam season. And if you're watching this, you probably have mocks on an Inspector Calls. Now remember, one of the major things you have to pay attention to when you are writing whatever question you choose in an Inspector Calls, when you are answering this question, make sure you completely move away from describing what's happening in the play. So do not, when you're answering the question, say, oh, this starts with Eva Smith's death and the inspector comes in, blah, 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 this, that, this, that. You need to move away from doing that, okay? That's a common error that students always make with Inspector Calls because the play and its plot is so easy to understand. They then walk straight into those mocks and then describe what happens in the play. It's super important to completely move away from that and go straight into, firstly, addressing the question's keywords, but then when you then select your strategic pieces of quotations and your strategic pieces of information that you're going to use in connection to the play, you then mention, why is this important when you think about Priestley's message? What are these key characters trying to demonstrate? And of course, how does this tie into the play's themes as well as context? So I'm going to get into it. What are the top 5 quotes that you should use in any Inspector Calls essay? The first, I'm going to begin with Inspector Gould's main message. Remember that this play was written to convey Priestley's socialist message of equality, and this was conveyed in Inspector Gould's parting statement when he said that we are members of one body. This metaphor, and the moment you start mentioning words like metaphor, you're already going into analysis. This metaphor is so powerful in driving home Priestley's socialist message. Equally, remember that Inspector Goole is supposed to be conveyed as Priestley's mouthpiece, and he is trying to demonstrate not only to the Birlings, but of course to Priestley's audience in post-1945 Britain that despite your superior status in terms of class, okay, so a lot of people who are watching this play were people who were of means, who were a bit more wealthier. He was trying to say that their destinies are still tied to the destinies of the poor, and if they ignore helping the poor, ignoring their duty and their social responsibility towards the poor, this would lead to social instability and yet another war kicking off, okay? That's the first quotation, and of course, as I've mentioned, it really ties really powerfully to Priestley's message of socialism, okay? That's really powerful context, but of course it cuts across the main themes like social responsibility and class. Now, the second quotation that you should use in any Inspector Calls GCSE mock exam essay is by Mr. Birling, because he typifies, okay, he encapsulates capitalism, okay, so he is really the ugly face of capitalism. And when he states a man has to make his own way, he is demonstrating this really rugged sense of individualism. Individualism is about just looking after yourself, not really caring about what other people are going through, not really caring, especially if you're an employer like him, okay, so you know you have the power to pay your workers more and make their lives better and reduce poverty, but you still decide, no, it's all about me, my company, and keeping all of my profits. We call that hardcore capitalism and of course rugged individualism. Use that type of language in your writing, by the way. Now, this quotation is really powerful, of course, because it demonstrates Priestley's criticism of capitalism, and of course Mr. Birling is used as a microcosm, a small version of a wider class of people who were businessmen and industrialists and wealthy people who owned these factories that employed people during the Edwardian era and paid them next to nothing. And of course, Mr. Birling is used as a symbol, a microcosm of these factory owners who were quite greedy and they were extremely selfish. They only saw life in society as us versus them, and they did not care about helping the poor or even paying the workers an equal wage. This quotation obviously ties into the theme of class. People like Mr. Birling made class divisions much worse. Of course, it even ties into the theme of gender, because of course, when he's talking about, you know, a man having to make his own way, he's also looking at it in terms terms of him being a man, as opposed to caring about how women were treated in society, women like Eva Smith and Daisy Renton, and trying to help them improve their lot in life, okay? So this quotation is really powerful. It's a heavy hitter. Not only can you use it to connect to all the main themes in the play, but of course, the context point that you want to make is to do with capitalism. And by the way, don't forget that during half-term week in October, okay, so if you're looking at this and you're like, okay, this is great, but how does this look like? How do I incorporate some of these ideas in an actual really top mark GCSE Inspector Calls essay? I'll be going over this in a one-off Inspector Calls GCSE masterclass during half term on the 29th of October. And in that live class, you can obviously ask me as many questions as you want. We'll be going over a grade 9 Inspector Calls GCSE essay, and I will also be sharing with all of my students who are part of that class a cheat sheet that they can use not only for their mocks, but also lots of my students who've been part of past literature weeks have used these cheat sheets for their final Inspector Calls GCSE exams all the way next summer. Now, the third quotation, which is really powerful, of course, is by Mrs. Birling when she looks down on women like Eva Smith and Daisy Renton, and she calls them girls of that class. Now, what's really interesting about Mrs. Birling's character, and I've mentioned this in past videos, I think Mrs. Birling's character is really powerful in conveying how there were many women who literally understood in the Edwardian period just how hard life was for many working class women. Remember that this was a time when women did not have equal pay. They didn't even have the right to vote. So Mrs. Birling was aware of this, and she still looked down on women like Eva Smith and Daisy Renton. She really didn't want to help them. Even if she was the head of a charity, it was more so for her social position and status, not actually because she cared about the women that she was helping. And this is really nicely demonstrated with even this diminutive noun, girls, right? She sees a grown woman like Daisy Renton as a girl. This demonstrates how also classism and, looking down on people from lower classes was really internalized even by women like Mrs. Birling. She was much more loyal to people from her class than her gender, okay? Now, the fourth quotation that you want to use in any Inspector Calls essay is when Sheila obviously demonstrates an awareness of the importance of looking out for people who are from lower social classes. She shows a really strong sense of humanity even earlier on in the play when her dad, Mr. Birling, says, "It's my duty to keep labour costs down." And then she critically responds by saying, "These girls aren't cheap labour, they're people," okay? Now, this quotation is so powerful, firstly, in demonstrating how Sheila arguably is the character that changes the most. She experiences the most powerful transformation from being this very naive girl to being somebody who actually is seen as an agent of change by Priestley. Remember that Priestley, especially when it came to the theme of age and his view of the younger generation, he actually believed social equality and social change will be driven by people like Sheila and even Eric, okay? And Sheila demonstrates this. She demonstrates her view that actually we shouldn't treat the working classes just as these objects to make us wealthier and then throw them away. Actually, their well-being is just as important as our well-being, even if we're part of upper class society. And of course, it ties really nicely to Inspector Goule's message when he says this metaphor, we are members of one body. Again, as you can see, I'm even moving between the quotations. That's what you want to do when you're writing and adding quotations in your Inspector Calls GCSE essay. You can even start shifting between the two quotations and contrasting. Okay, this is what Sheila says earlier, but actually later on in the play when Inspector Goole says we're members of one body, actually this is how it comes full circle. Now, as I said in your essay, when you then move away from describing what's happening in Inspector Calls to actually now moving towards not only analysing quotations, but also talking about these cross connections between different parts of the play, now this is where you find yourself getting a 6, 7, 8 or 9 in your Inspector Calls GCSE essay. And as I said, of course, if you have any questions or you literally just want to see now how that all is synthesized into an amazing grade 9 essay that you can use for your own revision, not only for your mocks, but even in your final Inspector Calls GCSE exams, just join in my one-off Inspector Calls GCSE masterclass on the 29th of October. Now, the fifth and final quotation is when Eric, right? And this quotation is interesting in demonstrating how men abuse their power. During this period in Edwardian England, he says, "I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty." Remember, What's really interesting, and this is a fact that's often overlooked by a lot of students who are studying Inspector Calls and talking about and thinking about Priestley's message. They get stuck at, oh, Priestley is a socialist, but they actually forget that also Priestley was a feminist. He also had a deeply feminist message that was running through the play. What I mean by that is he believed that women should be treated just as equally as men, and women should not be exploited and misused by men. And of course, Eric says this quotation to justify, assaulting Daisy Renton, okay, because he assaults her. Now, Priestley used him as a character to highlight also how life was really difficult for women during the Edwardian era, because they were seen as objects, especially if they were working class women, for men's pleasure, right? And Eric's character is used as a character to demonstrate how many men took advantage of women, not only from a work perspective, but also from a sexual exploitation perspective. And Eric's character is used to demonstrate this powerlessness and this theme of gender. So you also want to talk about that. You want to mention this notion of how Eva Smith, not only is she powerless from a class perspective, but she's also powerless, and she demonstrates the powerlessness of many women from a gender perspective. And this is shown by Eric's quotation, okay? And that's really it when it comes to your top 5 heavy hitting, powerful quotations to use in any Inspector Calls GCSE essay.